Tonight, we enter a place almost no one has seen, and even fewer dare to speak about. A vault so heavily guarded, so deeply hidden, that even popes have been denied full access. Not because it holds relics too sacred, but because it holds truths too dangerous. They call it the Vatican Apostolic Archive. But this is no ordinary library. This is where rewritten history sleeps, where forbidden knowledge waits in silence. Ancient texts sealed away, scientific breakthroughs erased, maps of worlds we never learned about, and memories of civilizations that were never supposed to be remembered. This isn't just about religion, it's about control, of time, of knowledge, of what humanity is allowed to know about its past and its potential. Behind those locked doors is a version of history no textbook dares to teach. A version that could shake everything we think we know. So, like the video, subscribe, because tonight we step closer to the one place we were never meant to enter, the Forbidden Vault, and what's inside may change everything. They say if you stand in the right hallway beneath Vatican City, the air gets colder, not because of the stone or the lack of sunlight, but because of what's hidden behind the walls. A door no tourist will ever see, a vault that officially doesn't exist. And behind that door, shelf after shelf of ancient manuscripts, sealed letters, lost histories, and forbidden books that the world forgot, or was forced to forget. This is not fiction. The Vatican's secret archives are real. But don't let the name fool you. It's not just secret in the usual sense. It's secret like a memory that's been erased. Like a room in your own house you're not allowed to enter. For centuries, popes have locked away anything they didn't want the world to see. And some of those records go back over 1,000 years. Unread, untouched, untold. The official story says it's just for safekeeping. That these documents are fragile, that scholars can request access, that it's all very normal. But think about this. In over 400 years, only a handful of people have ever been allowed to see more than a small sliver of it. You can't walk in, you can't browse. You have to know exactly what you're asking for. The problem is, you're not allowed to know what's there to ask for in the first place. Imagine finding a library where the books are so dangerous. They're hidden not for safety, but for control. Not just religious texts, but maps that show the world before the church said it began. Letters from scientists and astronomers whose discoveries were buried. Diaries of people who met with things, creatures, beings, events that history says never existed. These aren't just dusty old scrolls. They're time bombs, because if the truth ever got out, it could change everything. There are stories of lost gospels, ones that were kept out of the Bible, of early Christian texts that described angels not as glowing men with wings, but as terrifying forces of nature, of accounts that hint at technologies far ahead of their time. What else is hidden in those underground chambers? And, more importantly, why has it been kept from us? The silence surrounding the vault isn't accidental. It's engineered, carefully curated by centuries of popes, cardinals, and archivists sworn to secrecy. Some documents are so restricted, even the titles are classified. And every so often, when a new pope takes office, certain shelves are moved, recatalogued, or sealed for good. No explanation. No trail. So why does a place built on faith need a vault built on secrets? That's the question no one wants you asking. But it's where this story begins. Because the closer you get to the truth, the harder it becomes to ignore the walls. And behind those walls, in the cold silence of a locked archive, history waits. Not the history we're taught. The real one. The one someone tried very hard to erase. When the Roman Empire collapsed, it didn't just leave behind ruins and broken statues, it left behind chaos. Roads stopped being safe, libraries burned, cities forgot how to read. And in the middle of that collapse, something strange happened. One group didn't just survive the fall, they started writing the new story. That group was the Church. While kingdoms crumbled and languages died out, the Vatican was quietly gathering what was left. Old books, royal decrees, scrolls from scientists and historians. Anything that told the story of the ancient world. But they didn't just protect it, they filtered it, decided what was worth saving, what could be copied, what should disappear. They became the gatekeepers of memory. It sounds noble at first. Who else was going to protect history while Europe was falling apart? But here's the twist. When you're the only one holding the pen, you get to rewrite the ending. And sometimes the beginning too. Over time, the Church wasn't just storing knowledge. It was shaping it, editing it, erasing it. Imagine a fire destroying every history book in the world, except the copies hidden in one basement. Now imagine the person who owns that basement gets to rewrite the pages before anyone else reads them again. That's what the Vatican became. A vault of selected truths. A filter for what humanity was allowed to remember. Monks in candlelit rooms copied ancient texts by hand, but they didn't always copy them exactly. Passages were clarified, names were changed, dates were adjusted, some pages were simply left out. Heresy, they called it. Dangerous ideas had to be removed, even if those ideas were true. Bit by bit, the world forgot its past. Not because time took it, but because someone chose to hide it. By the time new rulers rose up, they depended on church records to understand who ruled before them. Schools taught from texts the church approved. Maps were redrawn using measurements the church allowed. And when scholars began to question what they were seeing, they were told it was better not to dig too deep. Some knowledge was sacred. Some memories were off limits. But the real danger wasn't what they remembered. It was what they forgot on purpose. When you control the past, you don't just shape the stories people tell. You shape how they think. You control their heroes, their fears, their limits. The Vatican wasn't just saving history. It was building a cage around it. And inside that cage, the truth sat quietly, waiting, because no one appointed them the guardians of memory. They took that role during the world's darkest hour, and once they had it, they never let it go. What would we remember if we could see the unedited past? That's what they don't want you to ask. That's what they've spent centuries making sure you never find out. When the Roman Empire collapsed, it didn't just lose cities or soldiers, it lost something bigger, something more permanent, knowledge, and not by accident. Across Europe, libraries burned, scrolls turned to ash, entire shelves of wisdom gone in a single night. Places like the Library of Alexandria weren't just destroyed, they were erased. And the question people rarely ask is this: who did it and why? We're told it was just the chaos of war, invading tribes, riots, vandals, but some of the destruction felt too precise, too targeted, like someone wanted the past to disappear. Books didn't just vanish, they were taken, removed, hidden. Monasteries across Europe suddenly became the new homes for texts that somehow survived the fires. But only some texts, the ones the church approved, the ones that didn't ask dangerous questions. The rest, they were gone. And not just scientific theories or old myths. We're talking about ancient maps showing lands we no longer recognize, star charts that don't match the sky today, diaries from people who claim to witness strange technologies or impossible events, gone. all of it. What if some of those missing manuscripts told a version of history that didn't match what we're taught? What if some of them revealed truths about humanity's past that could change everything we think we know? We call it the Dark Ages. But maybe the darkness wasn't from ignorance. Maybe it was from silence, from secrets, from knowledge being pulled out of the light and sealed behind locked doors. People forget how fragile memory is. One generation forgets to pass down a story, and it's gone. Now imagine if someone wanted that to happen, if they encouraged it or forced it. There are whispers of scribes who tried to hide copies, of monks who were caught smuggling forbidden books out of burning cities. Some say those copies still exist, buried in hidden vaults or forgotten caves. Others say they were all found and destroyed. But even in the ashes, there's a strange pattern. Every time something burned, something else was saved. Just enough to build a new story. One controlled by the Vatican. One where the gaps are filled with silence. And silence is easy to control. Ask yourself this. Who benefits from a world that can't remember what it used to be? Who gains power when ancient inventions, ideas, or discoveries are lost? The truth is, we may never know exactly what was taken, but the fact that we don't know, that's the clue. Because real history doesn't vanish by accident. Not like this. Not everywhere at once. Someone wanted us to forget, and they were very, very good at making sure we did. There's a strange hole in our history, a 1,000-year gap where almost nothing seems to happen. We call it the Dark Ages, but maybe that name hides more than it explains. From around 500 to 1500 AD, the timeline gets quiet, too quiet. Great civilizations had already risen and fallen. Ancient engineers had built aqueducts, pyramids, even machines. Then, suddenly, nothing. No inventions. No real maps. No art that wasn't religious. Just silence. And when people did try to record something, they mostly wrote about saints, relics, and church miracles. Not science, not discoveries, not progress. The question is, why? We're told it was a time of struggle. Plague, war, illiteracy. But history has always survived hard times before. So why did it vanish now? Why did an entire continent seem to forget how to write, build, explore, or even question? Unless they didn't forget. Unless someone made sure they stopped. During this strange blackout in time, only one institution kept writing. The Church. Monks copied texts by candlelight, but they decided which ones. They wrote the lives of saints, but not the lives of ordinary people. They preserved sermons, but not science. They painted pictures of heaven, but erased diagrams of machines. If the only voices you're allowed to hear are the ones that serve a purpose, then silence becomes a weapon. And here's where it gets even stranger. Some historians think parts of this era might not have even happened. That time itself was stretched, inflated, fabricated. It's called the phantom time hypothesis. A theory that someone added centuries that never existed to make the church's story seem older, to rewrite their origins, to hide something. Think about that. Not just rewriting events, but rewriting time. And who had the power to do that? Who controlled the clocks, the calendars, the scribes? The Vatican. There's power in a gap. When there are no records, you can insert your own. When no one remembers, you get to decide what they learn. And for 1,000 years, that's exactly what happened. The church became the center of knowledge. If you wanted to learn, you learned their version. If you questioned it, you vanished. It wasn't just about faith. It was about control. People today accept the Dark Ages like a fog we had to walk through. But what if it wasn't fog at all? What if it was a curtain, a wall built on purpose to hide something behind it? Something dangerous, something powerful. What we lost in that 1,000-year silence might be more than just stories or scrolls. It might be a different path for humanity, one where truth came before obedience, one where progress didn't have to wait for permission. But that version of the world never got to happen, because someone closed the door, and for 1,000 years they made sure no one opened it. In the quiet halls of ancient monasteries, history was rewritten with ink. Not all at once, not with fire or swords, but slowly, carefully, one word at a time. After the fall of Rome, the Church didn't just collect books, it edited them. Some changes were small, a phrase replaced, a chapter skipped, others were massive, entire texts vanished. Ideas banned, whole versions of the truth erased like they never existed. This wasn't an accident, it was a mission. To protect the faith, they said, to stop confusion. But behind those words was something else. Fear. Fear that the old knowledge might challenge the new authority, that some ancient voices might question the story being told from the pulpits. So the scribes got to work. Texts that spoke of strange machines, gone. Scrolls that hinted at other ways of understanding the stars, burned. Writings that described lost civilizations or forgotten gods, labelled heresy and destroyed. Even the Bible wasn't safe. Many don't realize there were dozens of Gospels once. Stories told by people who claimed to walk with Jesus. Some said he was a man, others said he was a spirit. Some spoke of love, others of knowledge and hidden wisdom. But only 4 were chosen to stay. The rest were declared dangerous, not because they were false, but because they didn't fit the version the Church wanted the world to follow. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Book of Enoch, all removed, all forgotten, until fragments started turning up centuries later in deserts, caves, and jars buried beneath the sand. Silent proof that someone tried to erase the past, and didn't quite finish the job. But even surviving texts weren't safe. They were copied and recopied by hand. And each time, changes could be made. Sometimes on purpose, sometimes as corrections. A sentence shortened, a word softened, a warning turned into a rule, a poem turned into a commandment. Imagine history like a painting. Every time someone touched it, they changed a colour, smoothed a detail, covered a face, until what remained looked nothing like the original. And no one noticed, because no one was allowed to see the original. Knowledge that didn't serve the Church's message was labelled dangerous. But dangerous to who? The people or the power? Truth, they said, was a gift, but only in pieces, only in the version approved by the ones in charge. Everything else was heresy, and heresy, they made sure, came with a price. Books chained to shelves, pages blacked out, scholars silenced, entire languages forgotten. Because when you can erase the words, you can erase the ideas. And when you erase the ideas, you erase the possibility of a different future. So the next time you read an ancient text, ask yourself, how much of this is original, and how much of it was rewritten in ink that no one was allowed to question? They looked harmless. Quiet men in robes, heads bowed, candles flickering beside them, copying words by hand, one letter at a time. But behind the silence and the scrolls, those monks held more power than most kings. After the empire fell, chaos took over. Cities crumbled, roads broke, libraries disappeared, but the church stayed, and inside its monasteries, something strange was happening. A new kind of power was forming, not with swords or gold, but with ink. Monks were told to preserve knowledge, and they did, but they also became the gatekeepers. They decided what got copied, what got left out, what needed adjusting, and what was simply too dangerous to survive. Most people couldn't read. Books were rare. A single page took hours to write, so whoever controlled the copies controlled the truth. And across Europe, that control lived in the hands of a quiet network of monasteries. Dozens of them. Hundreds, connected like a hidden web. If a text didn't align with church doctrine, it was changed. If it hinted at science, magic, or alternate versions of history, it was corrected or removed completely. Over time, the world forgot what it had once known, because the only knowledge that stayed was the kind that served the system. Monks were told they were protecting souls, shielding people from confusion, but some of them must have known, must have seen what was being taken. There are rumours of hidden copies, secret rooms, manuscripts smuggled under robes or buried beneath abbeys, but most never made it out. This wasn't just editing, it was rewriting the memory of a civilization. And the system worked. A monastery in Ireland could copy a text that had already been cleaned in Italy. A scribe in France would copy that version, and another in Spain would repeat it again until the original vanished completely. No one would even know it was missing. The monks became living filters, not just preserving knowledge, but shaping it, polishing it, erasing what didn't belong, and they were trusted. No one suspected them. They weren't warriors or priests or politicians. They were seen as humble, devoted, but that's what made them perfect. Because when power hides behind humility, it becomes almost invisible. And invisible power is the hardest kind to fight. By the time universities returned and books became easier to print, the damage was done. Whole chapters of human history had vanished, technologies forgotten, languages silenced, beliefs reshaped, and all of it passed quietly through the hands of men in robes. They weren't just monks. They were memory makers. And once they decided what the world was allowed to remember, no one could argue, because the only proof left behind was the version they had chosen to copy. Words are powerful. They can heal, they can harm, and sometimes they can control. And in the shadowy halls of church history, language became more than just a way to speak. It became a weapon. At first, the world spoke many tongues: Greek, Aramaic, Classical Latin. These were the languages of poets, scientists, and philosophers. The Old Latin, in particular, was rich and precise. It carried the thoughts of Rome, of Cicero, of the engineers and astronomers who shaped the ancient world. But then, something changed. As the church grew stronger, it began using a different form of Latin, ecclesiastical Latin. It was slower, simpler, and shaped to match doctrine. This wasn't just about words. It was about what those words could do, or what they could no longer do. Ecclesiastical Latin was easier to teach in sermons, but harder to use for complex thought. Ideas that once flowed in classical Latin became stiff and limited. Scientific terms vanished. Poetic expression faded. Philosophy was boiled down to religious repetition. The church said it was making Latin more holy. But in truth, it was cutting people off, from the past, from knowledge, from questions. Imagine if someone took your phone and replaced the keyboard. Suddenly, certain words just weren't there. You couldn't say them, couldn't search for them, couldn't even remember how they felt. Over time, you'd stop thinking those thoughts at all. That's what happened when ecclesiastical Latin replaced the older forms. Whole libraries became unreadable to anyone but trained clergy. Ancient texts were declared heretical or simply too confusing. Most people didn't notice. They were told the priests would explain it for them. But that explanation came with a price. You could only understand what you were allowed to understand. And that meant the truth wasn't something you could reach. It was something you had to be given or denied. Even today, many of the Church's oldest secrets are locked behind this language wall. Vatican documents, mysterious letters, forbidden texts, they all sit in Latin, but not the Latin of Rome. The Latin of obedience, of ritual, of silence. And here's the thing, if you wanted to learn classical Latin back then, you couldn't. It wasn't taught. It wasn't safe. Because if you could read the past, really read it, you might start asking dangerous questions. Questions about what was erased, what was changed, what was never translated at all. So instead, the Church taught a version of the language that was easier to control, easier to shape, easier to hide behind. The words sounded holy, but what they really carried was distance. Distance from the truth. Distance from freedom. And the deeper you fell into that system, the harder it became to tell where the silence ended and the control began. Not every name carved into history was real. Some were legends, some were mistakes, and some were made up on purpose. When you look at the long list of popes stretching back through the centuries, it feels impressive, like a solid chain of leaders guiding the Church from the beginning of time. But if you look closer, strange things start to show up. Gaps, repeats, names that only appear in one place, Vatican records, nowhere else. There are popes and saints written into official church history who have no proof of ever living. No letters, no writings, no coins, no graves. Just a name, a date, and silence. Take Pope Donus II, officially listed in some versions of the papal timeline, but there's no evidence he existed, no records from the time. Nothing but a name that seems to have slipped into the list centuries later. Some historians think it was a scribal error, others believe he was invented to cover a missing year, or to pad the timeline during a period when no real pope could be found. Then there are saints who were canonized with barely a whisper. Saint Philomena, for example. No historical documents, no eyewitness accounts, just bones found in a Roman catacomb and a name painted on the wall. The Church once embraced her, then quietly removed her from the official calendar centuries later, as if she'd served her purpose. Why create fake saints or popes? Because history isn't just about the past, it's about power. And when you control the timeline, you control the story. If you want to prove your church has existed without interruption, you can't leave blanks. If you want to inspire faith, you might invent a miracle worker, a martyr, a holy name for people to follow. And if something terrible happened, like a pope being killed, replaced, or never properly elected, it's easier to cover it up with a name no one will question. Most people wouldn't notice. Back then, they couldn't even read. They trusted the priests, trusted the church. If they were told Pope X ruled for 10 years and cured the sick, they believed it. And even today, we still repeat those stories, still list those names. But the truth is, some of those names never belonged to real people. They were placeholders, distractions, tools. History is supposed to be built on facts. But in the case of the early church, it's also built on faith. And sometimes, when faith and facts don't line up, one gets quietly erased or rewritten. So the next time you hear a name from deep in the past, a saint with no story, or a pope with no footprint, ask yourself a simple question. Who told us they were real? And who benefits if we never question it? What if we're not really living in the year we think we are? It sounds impossible, like a plot from a sci-fi movie. But some historians and researchers believe something strange happened to our calendar. That whole centuries were added in on purpose. Not just by accident, but as a way to rewrite history itself. It's called the phantom time hypothesis. The theory says that somewhere around the early Middle Ages, the calendar was tampered with. That's about 300 years, specifically from around 614 to 911 AD, never actually happened. No wars, no kings, no events. Just made-up dates slipped into the timeline. The idea first came from a German researcher named Heribert Illig in the 1990s. He noticed that certain historical events didn't line up. There were missing buildings, missing records, strange gaps in science and art. Even the stars didn't seem to match the dates. Think about it. Calendars are human inventions. They're based on the sun, the moon, the stars, but also on politics. The modern calendar we use today, the Gregorian calendar, came from Pope Gregory XIII in 1582. It was meant to fix earlier mistakes in the Julian calendar. But what if those mistakes were actually intentional? One theory suggests that Emperor Otto III and Pope Sylvester II wanted to rule during the year 1000. It sounded important, holy, apocalyptic, but they were living too early. So, they simply added the missing centuries to make the date match their vision. They rewrote time itself. And most people never noticed. They couldn't read. They had no way to check. All they knew was what the church told them. If the monks said it was 1000 AD, then that's what it was. No one questioned the math. But even today, the evidence feels strange. Archaeology shows fewer artifacts from the phantom centuries than from times before and after. Architecture didn't change much. Writings slowed down. It's as if the world pressed pause. Some call it the Dark Ages. Others wonder if those years were simply copied and pasted, not lived. If this is true, it changes everything. Imagine discovering you were born 3 centuries later than you thought, that the great stories of medieval kings, popes, and empires were partly fiction, that we've been following a fake timeline for over 1,000 years. Of course, mainstream historians reject the theory. They say the evidence is weak, that we have enough documentation from that period. But the Vatican holds some of the oldest and most protected documents on Earth. What if the answers are hidden there, deep inside the vault? The real question isn't just, did they add time? It's, who had the power to make us believe they didn't? Because if you can control the calendar, you can control the story. You can choose what people think happened, when they think it happened, and maybe even why it matters at all. Time feels like the one thing we can trust. A second is a second. A year is a year. But what if even time was rewritten, not by nature, but by people with power, ink, and an agenda? Before the calendar we use today, the world followed something called the Julian calendar. It was introduced by Julius Caesar way back in 46 BC. It worked well enough, but it wasn't perfect. It miscalculated the length of a solar year by about 11 minutes. That may not sound like much, but over centuries it added up. Seasons began to drift. Important religious holidays fell out of sync with nature. For the church, that was a problem. Easter, one of the holiest days, was no longer aligning with the spring equinox. And so, in 1582, Pope Gregory XIII stepped in. He created a new system, the Gregorian calendar. This is the one we use today. To fix the drift, he erased 10 days from the calendar. People went to bed on October 4 and woke up on October 15. 10 days, gone. But here's the strange part. The calendar wasn't just about correcting time, it was also about control. By redefining the calendar, the Church took charge of time itself. It decided what year it was, what day it was, when to celebrate, when to mourn, when to work, when to pray. The rhythm of life was no longer guided by the stars or the sun, it was guided by the Church's decisions. Not everyone accepted the change right away. Some countries didn't switch for over 300 years. Britain and its colonies didn't adopt the Gregorian calendar until 1752. By then, 11 days had to be dropped. People were angry. They felt like their lives had been stolen. Riots broke out. In some places, people shouted, "Give us our 11 days." But the Church stood firm. They had already shaped the calendar to match their theological goals. Religious feasts were rescheduled. Saints' days were adjusted. And historical events were re-anchored to new dates. It wasn't just about accuracy. It was about rewriting time to fit doctrine. And here's where it gets deeper. When you change time, you also change memory. If you can move the past around, you can hide things in plain sight. A lost document, a suspicious gap, a rewritten story, all covered by a simple change of date. Time became a trap, a beautiful one. Clean, organized, official. But behind the clean pages of calendars were decisions made in secret rooms by men in robes. Men who believed they were chosen to guard history or reshape it. So when you check today's date, remember, it's not just a number, it's a decision. One made centuries ago by people who believed they could speak for God. And maybe they didn't just change when we are. Maybe they changed where we are in the story too. The sky doesn't lie. That's what ancient astronomers used to say. Because no matter what humans wrote in books or carved into stone, the stars followed their own path. The moon moved. The planets shifted, and eclipses, those rare and powerful moments when the sun or moon disappears, were like cosmic fingerprints. You can't fake them. You can't erase them. You can only watch and record. That's what makes this part of the mystery so strange. See, for centuries, people all over the world wrote down eclipses. China, Babylon, Greece, the Middle East, even early medieval monks in Europe. They didn't always understand why they happened, but they knew they mattered. Some saw them as signs from heaven, others as omens of death. But what they all had in common was this: they kept records. Now here's where it gets weird. When modern scientists look at those eclipse records and try to match them with our current timeline, things don't always line up. There are eclipses that were supposedly seen in certain years, except astronomy says they couldn't have happened then. Or the sky shows an eclipse did happen, but no one at that time mentioned it. It's like the stars are telling a different story than the church-approved calendar. One theory says this is more proof of the phantom time hypothesis, that some of the dates we think are real were added later, that parts of history were shifted, stretched, or squeezed to fit a narrative. Because while humans can change books, edit calendars, and burn libraries, they can't change the way the Earth orbits the Sun. Think about that for a second. Let's say a total solar eclipse passed over Europe in the year 800. If our calendar is right, we should be able to go back in time and confirm that. The math should work, but sometimes it doesn't. The eclipse doesn't match the date, or it lands in the wrong place, or it's missing entirely. Astronomers call these anomalies. But anomalies are just mistakes we can't explain yet. Unless they're not mistakes at all, unless they're clues. And if they are clues, they point to one thing: the timeline has been tampered with. It's almost poetic. While humans were rewriting history down here on Earth, the sky above was silently keeping the real record. The stars didn't care about popes or emperors. The moon didn't follow Vatican orders. The heavens just kept moving, waiting for someone to notice the gap. Today, we use supercomputers to track every eclipse that's ever happened, or will happen, for thousands of years. It's precise, it's mathematical, and when it doesn't match the story we were told, maybe it's not the stars that are wrong. Maybe it's us, because the truth might not be buried in the ground or hidden in a vault. It might be written in the sky. Imagine seeing a machine that flies across the sky, lights flickering, silent and smooth. Now, imagine you're living in the year 800. No planes, no science textbooks, no idea what electricity is. What would you call it? A miracle. For centuries, people have looked at things they didn't understand and called them divine. Sometimes that was the only way to explain it. But what if it wasn't just confusion? What if miracles were used on purpose, to cover up real knowledge? The church had a powerful tool, the miracle excuse. It allowed them to take things they couldn't explain, or didn't want explained, and turn them into acts of God. It was perfect. No questions asked. If a monk healed someone with herbs and strange powders, it wasn't chemistry, it was a blessing. If a lost city used sound to lift stones, it wasn't technology, it was angelic power. And if a book described machines that shouldn't exist for another 1,000 years, it was either heresy or a holy mystery best left alone. By branding knowledge as divine, the church got two things. First, they kept control. If only saints or chosen priests could perform these miracles, they held all the power. Second, they created fear. Questioning a miracle was like questioning God, and that could get you burned. Some old manuscripts describe things that sound suspiciously modern. Spinning wheels that never stop, burning lights that need no fuel, flying discs, even machines that could see through flesh. But instead of investigating, those stories were either erased or labelled as divine visions. And this wasn't just about science. It was also about medicine, astronomy, even psychology. Ancient civilizations like the Egyptians, Greeks, and Persians had advanced understanding of the body, the stars, and the mind. But after Rome fell and the church took control, much of that knowledge vanished. What replaced it? Prayer, relics, and mystery. That's not to say faith and science can't coexist, but in this case, faith was used to erase the map, to blindfold the public, to build a wall between the people and the truth. It became easier to say it's a miracle than to admit we don't want you to understand this. Even today, we hear stories of ancient artifacts or mysterious inventions being discovered, only for them to disappear into private collections or sealed archives. Why? Because once you open the door to ancient knowledge, you open the door to questions. And questions can lead to doubt. Doubt in the timeline, doubt in the story, doubt in those who told it. So next time you hear the word miracle, pause. Ask yourself, was it really divine? Or was it something real, something powerful, that someone didn't want you to understand? Because sometimes, calling it a miracle is just a way to keep you from looking too closely. There's a list the church doesn't like to talk about. A list of books so dangerous, so forbidden, that simply owning one could get you excommunicated. or worse. This wasn't just a warning. It was an order, a command to forget, and for centuries it worked. They called it the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. At first, it sounds like fiction, a secret list of knowledge locked away. But it's real, and for hundreds of years, it shaped what millions of people were allowed to think, read, and believe. It started in the 1500s, during a time when the printing press had just been invented and ideas were spreading fast, too fast for the church to control. Books were dangerous, not because they were evil, but because they made people ask questions about the Bible, about history, about science, about the church itself. And when questions lead to doubt, power starts to slip. So the Vatican did something bold. They created a blacklist. It wasn't just one or two books, it was hundreds, then thousands. Titles from scientists like Galileo, philosophers like Descartes, even religious scholars who believed just slightly different things. If a book challenged doctrine, suggested new theories, or simply raised too many eyebrows, it was added to the index. And it wasn't just about burning books, it was about burning curiosity. Priests were trained to look for these titles. Libraries were forced to remove them. Owning a banned book became a crime against God. People lived in fear, not just of losing their faith, but of losing their lives, because reading the wrong thing could be seen as heresy. But who decided what was forbidden? A small group of powerful men, cardinals, theologians, church, censors. They sat in shadowy chambers and flipped through pages like judges at a trial. Their job wasn't to find truth, it was to find threats. And if a book didn't serve the story, it was silenced. Some of the books on the list are shocking. Ancient texts about medicine, astronomy, history, even works of fiction. Some were banned for teaching that the earth moves around the sun. Others for suggesting that time might not be what we think. Still others for exploring other faiths or lost civilizations. Imagine how many ideas were erased. Imagine how much knowledge was locked behind doors labelled "Do Not Open." The index wasn't officially abolished until 1966. That's right, 1966. By then, the list had grown to over 4,000 banned books. But even after it ended, its damage lingered, because once you silence a question, it can take generations to hear it again. And maybe that was the point. Because if you control what people read, you control what they believe. And if you control what they believe, you control history itself. The index didn't just hide books, it hid futures. There's a place beneath Rome where sunlight never touches. A place older than most countries. A place guarded not by soldiers, but by silence. They call it the Vatican Secret Archive. But there's a part of it that no one talks about. A section so hidden it doesn't even appear on maps. And some say even the Pope can't get inside. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it's not. It's a reality wrapped in rules, locked behind gates, buried under layers of time and power. The Vatican does have an official archive. It spans over 50 miles of shelves. Documents dating back more than 1,000 years. Letters from emperors, notes from exorcists, ancient Bibles, scientific discoveries, secrets written in forgotten languages. But that's just the part they admit to. Scholars can request access to small sections if they're approved. There are forms, background checks, and lots of waiting, but even then, most of the archive remains sealed. Entire corridors are off limits, locked with codes, guarded with cameras. Catalogues don't list them, floor plans don't show them. It's as if they were never built. Except they were. There are rumours of sub-levels, Hidden vaults below the known ones, sections with no name, no lights, no air, whispers of maps that lead nowhere, books chained in metal cabinets, and guards who never speak. Some say these vaults hold the real secrets, the ones that could unravel the story we've been told. Documents from before the Bible was assembled, blueprints for inventions that shouldn't exist, proof that the timeline of history is broken, evidence of visits from beings we've forgotten or been told to forget. And the most unsettling part, even popes have reportedly been denied entry. Not officially, of course, but stories have leaked over time, of pontiffs who asked too many questions, who wanted to read everything, who were quietly told, "You don't have clearance." Imagine that, the head of the church, blocked from his own basement. That's not just security, that's something else. It means someone, or something, is guarding more than just paper. Maybe it's truth, maybe it's power, maybe it's a past so different it would flip the world upside down. And if a vault exists that's not on any map, then what else exists? What else have we not been told? Because this isn't about hiding books anymore. It's about hiding reality, editing time, controlling the narrative from the deepest room on earth. A vault with no address, no label, no key, just a silence that stretches for centuries. Some stories don't make the news. They happen in shadows, in dusty corners of old monasteries or private libraries. A scholar stumbles upon something strange, a scroll, a codex, a book that doesn't match the official story. Maybe it's written in a forgotten tongue. Maybe it describes events that shouldn't exist. Maybe it names names. Whatever it is, it wasn't supposed to survive. And that's when the knock comes. Not loud, not forceful, but precise. A man in black robes, or sometimes in a suit, always polite, always carrying credentials stamped with Vatican seals. He says the same thing every time. We're here to preserve this manuscript. For safety. For study. It's too fragile to remain here. Most people don't argue. The person delivering the request speaks calmly, but carries an unspoken weight. They never threaten. They never explain. And yet the book is handed over every time, quietly, without resistance. And once it's gone, it's never seen again. There's no public record, no announcement, no digital trace. Even the scholar who found it might be told they misread the contents, that it was nothing, that it's being reviewed by specialists. But when they follow up months later, they're told there's no file, no update, no proof it ever existed. These aren't fairy tales, they're patterns, repeated across countries and centuries. From the caves of Egypt to the vaults beneath French cathedrals, from Tibetan monasteries to forgotten towers in Spain. Anytime something surfaces that doesn't match the accepted version of history, someone comes to collect it. They don't call themselves spies. They're usually historians, theological consultants, archivists, but their timing is always perfect. It's like they know the moment something forbidden is touched. And maybe they do. Some believe there's a network, a system of watchers that monitors rare book sales, university finds, and even amateur discoveries, algorithms that flag keywords, agents who monitor language translations, eyes always watching for leaks in the timeline, because a single document can be dangerous. One scroll that says the pyramids are older than we think, one page that suggests Jesus had siblings, one map that shows lands not discovered for another 1,000 years, one drawing of a machine centuries ahead of its time. That's all it takes to shake everything. And the Church has had 2,000 years to perfect the art of making things disappear. They call it preservation. But preservation for who? For what? If no one sees it again, is it really being saved? Or is it being buried? So next time you hear about a strange manuscript being retrieved, ask yourself this: are they protecting history? Or are they protecting the story? Because sometimes silence is louder than any lie. Long before there were churches or crosses or popes in white robes, people looked to the skies and asked the same questions we still ask today. Where did we come from? Why are we here? What happens when we die? But the answers they found, scribbled on clay tablets, etched into stone, inked onto animal skin, are not the ones we're taught now. Some of those answers were too wild, too dangerous, too old. And some say those answers are still hidden, just not where you'd expect. They say the Vatican holds texts that predate the Bible, not just by a few years, but by centuries, millennia, manuscripts older than Moses, stories that trace back to the first writing systems, Sumerian, Akkadian, even the lost language of the Indus Valley, myths that talk about gods descending from the stars, records of ancient kings who ruled for thousands of years, and timelines that don't fit. These aren't just legends passed down by word of mouth. These are physical objects, real pages, bound in leather, stored in silence, some found in desert caves, some rescued from collapsing temples, others taken quietly from private collections and sealed behind reinforced doors. You won't find them in any museum. They're too controversial. Because they don't just challenge Christianity, they challenge everything. Some describe a flood story almost identical to Noah's, but written 2,000 years earlier. Others talk about divine messengers with wings of fire and voices that shook the earth long before the word angel existed. There are scrolls that trace back to forgotten civilizations, ones that don't show up on any map, and tablets that speak of a time when knowledge was forbidden not by God, but by kings afraid of its power. The people who wrote these texts didn't think in terms of sin or salvation. They thought in cycles, stars rising and falling, time looping like seasons, birth, death, and rebirth, not just of people, but of entire worlds. So why would the Church keep these things? If they don't align with their teachings, why not destroy them? Because sometimes hiding something gives you more power than burning it. If no one knows it exists, it can't be questioned, it can't be studied, it can't wake anyone up. And maybe, deep down, they're afraid that if even one of these texts got out, people might start wondering, not just about religion, but about memory, about how much of what we believe is built on silence, about what was erased to make the Bible the only book that mattered. Somewhere in a vault beneath Rome, behind sealed iron doors and layers of secrecy, those old voices are still there, waiting, whispering. And if we ever heard them again, we might realize we've been reading the story from the middle, not the beginning. Something doesn't add up when you look at European history. If the Romans had aqueducts, concrete, surgical tools, even basic steam power 2,000 years ago, then why did Europe seem to forget everything for almost 1,000 years? Why did it take so long for the most basic technologies to return? It's like science vanished, not slowly, suddenly, like someone pulled a curtain down and pretended the stage was empty. Historians call it the Dark Ages, a time when books stopped being written, discoveries stopped being made, and knowledge was kept behind monastery walls. But here's the weird part. In other parts of the world, science kept moving forward. In the Middle East, scholars were building observatories and translating Greek texts. In Asia, People were inventing compasses, printing presses, and complex machines. Yet in Europe, people were still being told the earth was flat and diseases were caused by demons. It wasn't that Europeans were incapable of learning, it was that someone controlled what they were allowed to know. The church had the power, and they believed knowledge was dangerous if it didn't fit their worldview. So texts that explained astronomy, mathematics, medicine, they weren't just ignored. They were hidden, rewritten, burned. You weren't supposed to ask questions. You were supposed to have faith. There are stories of early inventors creating strange devices, mechanical clocks before they were invented, models of the solar system, even gliders based on the shapes of birds. But their work was often destroyed or forgotten, not because it didn't work, but because it worked too well. The archives of the Vatican may still hold the blueprints, sketches of machines lost to time, pages from lost books that spoke of energy, motion, chemistry, stars, not miracles, just science. But science that didn't serve the church's narrative. Imagine if a device was found that could predict eclipses, or explain disease, or fly through the air. In a time when the church claimed only God could do those things, anyone who built such a thing would be accused of heresy, or worse. And so inventions weren't shared, they were buried. Some believe we lost centuries of progress, that the Renaissance didn't mark the beginning of science in Europe, it marked the slow rediscovery of what had already been known. And even then, the church had its hand in what was allowed to return. It makes you wonder, what could we have become if that science had been allowed to grow, if those minds had been nurtured instead of silenced, if truth hadn't been put on trial? Maybe the real miracle isn't how far we've come. Maybe it's that we made it this far at all, with so much knowledge deliberately erased. And maybe some of that knowledge is still waiting, locked away, hidden in a vault, beneath marble floors, written in ink and dust, whispering about what Europe could have been if only it had been allowed to remember. If you could rewrite the past, you could control the future. That's the idea behind something called historical memory. It's not just what happened, it's what people remember happening, and maybe more importantly, what they forget. Now imagine having the power to decide what entire generations learn, believe, and repeat without ever realizing who planted those ideas in the first place. That's what the Vatican may have done across Europe for centuries. After the fall of Rome, Europe was in chaos. Kings came and went, borders shifted. But one thing stayed the same: the church. While empires crumbled, the Vatican kept growing, and with it came schools. At first, these were religious institutions run by monks, but soon they became the only place to learn how to read or write. If you wanted an education, you had to learn their version of history. Think about that. All the textbooks, all the lessons, all the stories about the past, they came through a single filter. And anything that didn't match church doctrine was removed or reworded. Ancient myths were rewritten as parables, pagan gods became demons, old inventions became miracles, and inconvenient truths, they vanished completely. The church wasn't just shaping belief, it was shaping memory, teaching generations to see the world a certain way, a map where the Vatican was always at the centre, a timeline that led to Christ as the climax of history. Everything before him was primitive or evil. Everything after him was guided by divine light, so long as it followed the church. Even libraries weren't safe. Books were chained, literally, locked to desks so no one could steal or spread dangerous ideas. Other texts were kept in special rooms, only shown to those with permission. The Vatican, even kept lists of banned books, hundreds of titles that were never to be read by ordinary people. And censorship didn't stop at religion. The Church had opinions on astronomy, medicine, language, even geography. If you taught something that didn't match their view, you risked being silenced or worse. Galileo wasn't the only one. There were many others whose discoveries were either buried or claimed by the Church years later. Now, here's the creepy part. This influence lasted a long time. Even after science and printing presses spread, the original curriculum, written in monasteries and approved by bishops, remained the foundation for schools across Europe. That means much of what we learn today still echoes decisions made in candlelit halls centuries ago. So, what happens when you trust one gatekeeper with the keys to knowledge? What happens when the archive becomes more powerful than the truth itself? Maybe that's the real power of the Vatican, not just in what it believes, but in what it made the world forget. The invisible hand wasn't a sword or a crown, it was a pen, quiet, careful, and dangerously good at hiding the lines it erased. Before satellites, before GPS, before even the idea of New World and Old World, there were maps that didn't make sense. Maps that showed coastlines nobody had supposedly discovered yet, mountains that hadn't been explored, islands that vanished. One of the most famous is called the Piri Reis map, and it's not just strange, it's terrifying if you think about what it means. Drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis, the map shows parts of Europe, North Africa, and Brazil. But that's not the weird part. It also shows a piece of Antarctica. Not just the icy version we know today, but Antarctica without ice. With detailed contours of the land underneath, like someone had mapped it before it was frozen. According to science, that ice has been there for thousands of years. So who saw it before the ice? Even crazier, Piri Reis didn't claim to make it all up himself. He said his chart was copied from even older sources, ancient sea charts from explorers, long forgotten. Some say those originals came from the Library of Alexandria. Others whisper that they were preserved in secret collections across Europe. But one thing's for sure, those older maps are gone now, lost. Hidden or destroyed. Why would someone want them gone? Maps are dangerous. They tell you where you've been. But more importantly, they tell you where you shouldn't go, where power wants you to stay blind. If ancient civilizations had mapped the world more accurately than the people who came centuries later, it would destroy the story we've been told about progress, about discovery, about who knew what and when. The Church controlled much of the knowledge in Europe during the Middle Ages, and they weren't fans of contradictions. If a map showed lands that didn't fit biblical geography, it had to go. If it hinted at people or civilizations that weren't in the religious timeline, it was heresy. Better to hide it than explain it. And so these maps started to disappear. Not with fire and smoke, but with silence. They weren't debated, they weren't corrected, they were just erased. Libraries lost them. Museums forgot them. Historians ignored them, until one or two slipped through the cracks, like Piri Reis. Today, that map is kept locked away in a museum in Turkey. It's incomplete, worn, and only a fragment. But it still raises questions the official story can't answer. Who made the originals? How did they know so much? And why did their work vanish for centuries? Maybe the maps weren't just lost, maybe they were taken. Removed, like pages from a book someone didn't want you to finish. Because if you could see the full map, maybe you'd start asking the wrong questions. And maybe the wrong questions are exactly what the world needs. In the hills outside Rome, hidden behind thick stone walls and guarded gates, sits something most people don't expect the Vatican to own: a high-tech observatory, telescopes, astronomers, computers tracking stars and watching the sky. But this isn't a new project. The Vatican has been watching the heavens for centuries, and not just out of curiosity. There's a deeper reason they've kept their eyes on the stars, and kept the results hidden from the rest of us. The Vatican Observatory began officially in the 1500s, but records hint they were charting celestial movements even earlier. When Galileo looked through his telescope and saw that Jupiter had moons, the Church silenced him. Not because he was wrong, but because he was right. His discoveries didn't match what the Church wanted people to believe, and that was a threat. So, instead of fighting new astronomy in public, the Church decided to study it in private. Today, the Vatican's main observatory is in Castel Gandolfo, but they also operate a powerful telescope in Arizona. Why so far from Rome? Because that one has better views of deep space. They call it the VAT, the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope. Think about that. While telling millions of believers that heaven is above and Earth is the center, they've been using state-of-the-art equipment to study galaxies, black holes, and possibly even something more. Some believe they're looking for signs of something ancient. Not just stars, not just planets, but messages, patterns, things that could rewrite everything we know about our place in the universe. Others say they're tracking cycles of destruction, comets, solar flares, events that come every few thousand years and wipe out civilizations, events that may have already happened once or more. But if that's true, why not tell us? Why keep it secret? Because knowledge is power. If you understand how the stars move, you can predict things. Eclipses, seasons, maybe even disasters. Ancient civilizations used the sky like a giant clock. The Church knew that. If they controlled the calendar, they controlled time. If they controlled time, they controlled history. And if they controlled history, they could shape faith itself. So the Vatican didn't stop watching the stars. They just stopped talking about it. Inside their archives are sky charts from centuries ago, lunar maps, solar cycles, even old manuscripts about strange lights in the sky that don't match any known star or planet. Were they comets? Ships? Signs? We'll probably never know, because those documents aren't open to the public. Not even most scientists can access them. The Vatican says their observatory is just about faith and science living together. But maybe it's something more. Maybe it's about keeping the real story of the heavens locked away. Because if we looked too closely, we might realize we've been staring at a false sky all along, and the truth might be hidden in plain sight, above our heads and behind Vatican walls. There was a time when asking the wrong question could get you killed. Not because it was violent, not because it was dangerous, but because it made people think. And thinking, in certain eras of history, was one of the most dangerous things you could do. The Vatican wasn't just a place of worship. It was also a center of control, of truth, rewritten, of stories, edited. And when someone dared to dig too deep or question too loudly, they became a threat. Not to God, but to the version of God the Church wanted the world to believe in. Giordano Bruno was one of those threats. He believed the universe was infinite, that stars were suns with their own planets, that maybe, just maybe, we weren't alone. He said these things out loud. He wrote them down. He dared to imagine more than what the Church allowed, so they burned him alive in the middle of a public square, not because he was violent, but because he was curious. Galileo Galilei built a telescope and looked at the sky. What he saw didn't match the official version of the cosmos. The Earth, he realized, wasn't the center of everything. But the Vatican couldn't let that truth spread, so they dragged Galileo before their courts, made him recant, and sentenced him to house arrest for the rest of his life. A prison made of silence. There were others too. Scholars who translated forbidden texts. Doctors who studied anatomy when it was outlawed. Mathematicians who saw patterns the church refused to see. Some vanished. Others were exiled. A few were tortured. All of them learned the same lesson. Curiosity came at a cost. But why was curiosity so threatening? Because curiosity cracks the walls of control. It asks why. It digs under the surface. It doesn't stop at what we're told. And that scared those who built power on certainty. If people started thinking for themselves, they might realize the stories didn't add up. They might find books hidden away, or timelines that felt wrong, or truths that made the church look less divine and more human. So instead of answering questions, the Vatican buried them, and instead of rewarding seekers, they punished them, sometimes with fire, sometimes with chains, always with fear. Even today, some of the church's archives remain off-limits. Documents about science, astronomy, medicine, and history. Sealed, protected, as if knowledge itself is something to be locked away. But people still ask, they still wonder. They still look up at the stars, or down into old manuscripts, and whisper the same dangerous thought, what if there's more? And that's the spark they couldn't fully extinguish, because you can burn a man, you can silence a voice, but you can't unask a question. And once someone starts to see the cracks in the story, they'll never stop looking for what was hidden behind them. They called themselves teachers, missionaries, explorers, but the Jesuits were something more, something quieter, something sharper. While popes stood in gold robes and spoke to crowds, the Jesuits moved in silence. Their power wasn't in public blessings. It was in what was written, what was preserved, and what was erased. The Jesuit order was born during a time of chaos, wars, reformation, fear. The church needed defenders, not with swords, but with minds, and the Jesuits were brilliant. Fluent in languages, skilled in philosophy, masters of debate. But beneath that polished surface was a mission most people never saw, a mission of silence. Jesuit scholars travelled the world collecting knowledge, ancient manuscripts, local legends, scientific discoveries. They went to Asia, Africa, and the Americas. They listened, they observed, and then they sent everything back to Rome. But not everything made it to public libraries. Some texts disappeared. Some ideas were never mentioned again. Some facts were folded into official doctrine so smoothly you'd never notice they weren't always there. It wasn't just what they found, it was how they told the story. The Jesuits became teachers in the most powerful schools of Europe. They wrote the textbooks, trained the historians, decided which versions of the past were repeated and which were forgotten. One Jesuit could shape a generation of thinkers. 10 could shape a country. 100 could quietly reshape history. They weren't sloppy. They were precise, careful with dates, exact with words. If a timeline needed adjusting to fit a church narrative, they knew how to do it. If an ancient document hinted at something uncomfortable, they knew how to frame it, not with fire, but with ink. And they did it without noise. While other orders argued or protested, the Jesuits simply worked, quietly, faithfully, and always in the shadow of something bigger. Some believe their mission wasn't just religious. It was about control, not to lie, but to guide, to make sure people believed what would keep them obedient, peaceful, predictable. And if a few truths had to vanish for that to happen, so be it. Inside the Vatican archives, there are shelves filled with Jesuit reports, letters, translations, eyewitness accounts, but many of them aren't public, and maybe that's the point. Their real power was never in the spotlight. It was in what they quietly shaped behind it. The world remembers the bold popes and the loud preachers, but it forgets the quiet men in black robes who whispered into the ears of kings, who edited textbooks without ever signing their names, who sat with ancient scrolls and decided which parts the world would get to remember. The Jesuits were more than priests. They were memory engineers, and maybe that's why their silence was never empty. It was full of intention, full of strategy, and full of secrets the rest of us were never meant to find. The Renaissance was supposed to be a rebirth, a great explosion of art, science, and human potential. But what no one talks about is how long that spark was delayed. For almost 1,000 years, Europe stood still. People lived and died without ever questioning why the stars moved or how the body worked. It wasn't because the answers didn't exist, it was because they were locked away. Ancient knowledge never really vanished. It was buried, hidden in dusty scrolls, kept in monasteries, or tucked inside foreign libraries that the average person would never see. The church didn't destroy all of it. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they held it in silence, letting the world forget what it once knew. And when they finally allowed it to come back, it didn't return all at once. It arrived in carefully timed waves. A rediscovered manuscript here, a translated book there, slowly, gradually. Just enough to spark wonder, but not enough to spark rebellion. You might wonder why. Why hold back knowledge that could make the world better, smarter, freer? The answer is control. Knowledge changes people. It makes them ask questions, dangerous ones. If people started reading ancient texts that talked about other gods, other systems of thought or science that didn't need miracles, they might start thinking for themselves, and that was a risk the church couldn't take. So instead, the return of knowledge was choreographed. Safe texts came first, ones about art and poetry, harmless things. Then a little bit of ancient philosophy, but only the versions that could be twisted to support church ideas. Scientific writings were the slowest, especially if they challenged the idea that Earth was the centre of everything. It's no coincidence that some of the most brilliant thinkers of the Renaissance were either monitored by the Church or worked under its approval. Others, like Galileo, were silenced when they went too far too fast. The Church wanted progress, but only the kind it could control. Even the printing press, which could have spread ideas like wildfire, was kept in check. Books needed approval, and many didn't get it. So the Renaissance happened not when the world was ready, but when the Church said it was. Imagine all the discoveries that could have been made centuries earlier if ancient knowledge hadn't been kept behind locked doors. Imagine inventions that could have changed medicine, navigation, or energy, delayed simply because they didn't fit the timeline of faith. The Renaissance wasn't just a celebration of rediscovery. It was a reminder of everything that had been kept from humanity, not by accident, but by design. A design that ensured power stayed where it always had, in the hands of those who decided what you could know and when you were allowed to know it. Not everything lost stayed lost. Some knowledge slipped through the cracks. Whispers passed from one hand to another in candlelit rooms and hidden circles. While the official story of history was being written in grand halls and holy offices, another story was being remembered in secret, a story kept alive by those who refused to forget. They were called many names: alchemists, heretics, dreamers. But over time, one group kept showing up in the shadows of history: the Freemasons. Not as the rulers of the world, like some conspiracy theories claim, but as quiet archivists. Guardians of memory. People who believed that truth was too important to be buried under politics or burned at the stake. No one can say for sure where they started. Some say they began as stoneworkers building the great cathedrals of Europe. Others think they're the last thread of older mystery schools that go back to Egypt or even Atlantis. What matters is not where they came from, but what they tried to protect. Symbols, texts, forgotten teachings. The pieces that didn't fit into the version of reality controlled by the church. Imagine you're living in a time when owning the wrong book could get you killed, when questioning official history could mean prison or worse. How would you pass on dangerous ideas? You'd do it in whispers, in codes, in symbols carved into stone or painted into the corners of cathedrals. You'd hide truth in plain sight. That's exactly what many believe these secret societies did. They preserved what others tried to erase, not to rebel loudly, but to keep the flame alive for a future that might need it. Their meeting places were quiet, their oaths strict, and their rituals filled with layered meanings. Every compass, every square, every eye had a story behind it, a memory encoded in geometry and light. The church watched them, sometimes even joined them. Popes and kings were known to be Freemasons, but not all of them, and certainly not the ones who questioned too much. Those were either removed or silenced, which makes you wonder what secrets were too dangerous even for powerful men to keep. Some believe that within Masonic lodges and other secret brotherhoods there were maps that showed forgotten lands, books that predated the Bible, devices that proved science didn't start in Europe. Others say they guarded the truth about Jesus himself, or time, or the stars. It sounds unbelievable until you realize how much was taken from public view and how organized the taking was. The whisper networks weren't about control, they were about protection. In a world where speaking truth could cost you everything, the safest way to keep knowledge alive was to keep it quiet. And today we're left with clues, carvings, temples, symbols that almost speak, but only if you know how to listen. And maybe that's the point. Maybe some truths aren't shouted. Maybe they survive because someone chose to whisper. History is supposed to follow a straight line. One ruler dies and another takes the throne. One year ends and the next begins. But what if that line isn't as clean as we think? What if parts of it were cut out, duplicated, or moved around like pages in a book someone didn't want us to read too closely? Look at the ancient timelines, and you start to notice odd things. Emperors with nearly identical names ruling at the same time in different parts of the world. Battles that happened more than once with the same outcome. Entire dynasties that seem to mirror others, almost word for word. Are these just coincidences, or is something else going on? Some scholars have pointed out these strange overlaps. A Roman ruler with a nearly identical story to a Byzantine one, two pharaohs from different centuries with the same victories. Cities destroyed by fire in multiple centuries, but with no record of being rebuilt in between. It's as if someone copied a chapter, pasted it a few pages later, and hoped no one would notice. Even calendars don't always agree. Chinese records mention eclipses that don't match what European history says happened that year. Middle Eastern astronomers track stars that didn't line up with Western dates. It's like puzzle pieces from different boxes were forced to fit one single image, and when something didn't fit, it was quietly removed. But who would do that and why? Some say it was a mistake, that early historians just made errors and those errors were passed down. But others think it was intentional, that certain people wanted to rewrite the story to make it cleaner, more controlled, easier to trace power from one chosen point to another. If history is a weapon, then timelines are its trigger. Control the dates, and you control the meaning of everything that came before. There's a theory called the phantom time hypothesis. It suggests that up to 300 years of history might have been completely made up, inserted between real centuries to serve a political or religious purpose. That's why some monuments are too well preserved. Why some rulers never appear in records outside the church. Why we don't have the physical evidence to match certain eras. It sounds wild until you start adding up the inconsistencies. Even modern archaeology finds things that shouldn't exist where they are. Tools too advanced for their layer of soil. Bones that belong to people we're told hadn't evolved yet. Wall paintings of events supposedly centuries away. Every time someone digs, they risk finding something that doesn't match the official script. A timeline with missing pieces isn't just confusing, it's dangerous. Because if we can't trust what year it is, how can we trust anything built on top of that year? The rise of nations, the fall of empires, the roots of religion, it all starts to blur. And maybe that's exactly what someone wanted. Not to erase history, but to rearrange it. To take the pieces and make a different story. One that benefits the storyteller. Sometimes the truth isn't buried in the ground, it's written in the sky. Long before humans carved history into stone or inked it onto parchment, the stars were already keeping a perfect record. The sun rises, the moon follows, and eclipses happen like clockwork. Celestial events don't lie, which makes it a problem when our timelines do. Astronomers today can track every solar and lunar eclipse going back thousands of years. They can map comets and planetary alignments with pinpoint accuracy. These are not myths or stories, they're physics, math. But when experts started comparing ancient records with what the sky actually did, they noticed something strange. Some of the events don't match, not even close. Take the medieval chronicles that mention a total solar eclipse over Europe in a specific year. According to NASA and modern sky models, that eclipse never happened. There was no shadow over that land on that day. So either the scribes lied or the date is wrong. Now, imagine that happening not once, but over and over. Stars recorded as appearing centuries too early. Comets described in the wrong era. Moons rising where they shouldn't be. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with pieces that come from two different boxes. One of the most famous contradictions involves Halley's Comet. It returns every 76 years like clockwork. Ancient Chinese astronomers recorded it with incredible detail. But some of the European sightings don't line up. They either come too soon or too late compared to what the sky says. That means one of two things. Either someone changed the dates, or entire periods of history were inserted or erased after the fact. And it's not just eclipses and comets. The alignment of stars in old navigation charts doesn't match where those stars should have been if the dates were correct. Ancient temples built to line up with the solstice sun now miss their mark. Not because the earth changed, but because the calendar did. The math doesn't lie, but maybe someone else did. Why does this matter? Because when the sky says no, everything we think we know gets shaken. If the timeline is off by even a few decades, then rulers may not have existed when we thought they did. Wars might have happened in a different century. Religious texts written in one era may have actually been copied from a much earlier time. It calls the entire structure of our past into question. And maybe that's why this kind of research isn't talked about much, because it's hard to argue with the sky. You can censor a book, you can rewrite a scroll, but you can't erase the path of the moon. You can't unburn a star. The heavens don't forget. So when the records on Earth start to crumble, the sky becomes the witness, quiet, ancient, untouched, and it's been telling a very different story, one we were never meant to hear. Time isn't just about hours and minutes, it's about power. Whoever controls the clock controls the story. They decide what counts as the past and what gets forgotten. In medieval Europe, that power didn't belong to scientists or kings, it belonged to the church. For most of history, regular people didn't have watches or calendars. Time was told by bells from towers, sunrise and sunset, and church feast days. The church wasn't just the spiritual authority, it was the timekeeper of civilization. And that wasn't an accident. The shift began with something that seemed harmless, a calendar reform. By the time Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian calendar in 1582, the old Julian calendar was out of sync with the solar year by about 10 days. Easter was drifting further from spring. It was a problem for the church because timing religious holidays with the seasons had huge spiritual and political meaning. So they made a change. 10 days were erased. October 4 was followed by October 15. Just like that. Gone. People accepted it because it came from God's representatives. But behind the scenes, something deeper was happening. With the calendar in their hands, the church didn't just correct time. They redefined it. They became the gatekeepers of when things happened. When wars were fought. When rulers died. When Christ was born. And when you decide when Christ was born, you also decide how old the world is, what year it is, who ruled before who. The church didn't just shape the story of salvation, they shaped the story of history itself. That's why so many ancient rulers dated their reigns in the year of our Lord. It tied their rule directly to the church's timeline. To question the calendar was to question divine authority. It was heresy. But here's the thing. Some historians think the church used that trust to do more than just clean up time. They think entire centuries may have been added to the calendar, or shifted. It's called the phantom time hypothesis. It suggests that some of the years we think existed never actually happened, that they were inserted to legitimize certain emperors or line up prophecies with political goals. If true, it would mean we're not living in the year we think we are. Even if that theory sounds wild, the pattern is clear. Time has always been a tool, not just for counting days, but for creating order, predicting the future, controlling the past. When people don't know what time it really is, they're easier to control. They don't know what came before or what's been lost. So, the next time you check the date, think about who wrote it, who printed it on your calendar, who decided the year. Time seems natural, but like so many things, it's a story. And stories are written by those in power. The church knew that, and they used the clock not just to ring the hours, but to rule them. By the 1800s, Europe was changing fast. Empires were growing, factories were rising, people were moving to cities, but something else was quietly happening behind the scenes. The way people were taught to think about the past was being rewritten, and the ones doing the rewriting were not always historians. In many cases, it was the church, specifically the Vatican. At a time when most people still couldn't read or write, schools became powerful tools. Governments wanted order, the church wanted obedience, so the classroom became a battleground for influence. And textbooks were the new scriptures. Many schools in Europe, especially in Catholic countries, were run or approved by the Church. That meant the Vatican had a strong hand in deciding what children learned, not just about religion, but about history, science, even how to read maps. Entire generations grew up with a version of the past that was carefully shaped, smoothed over, cleaned up, or in some cases, completely altered. Stories that didn't fit the Church's version of events were simply left out. Ancient civilizations that spoke of different gods or cosmic cycles were described as primitive or pagan. Scientific thinkers who challenged the Church were turned into villains or ignored completely. The idea was simple: teach children what supports the system and make sure they never ask the wrong questions. By the mid-19th century, governments began taking more control of education. But the fingerprints of the Vatican were already deep in the foundation. The Church had helped shape what was considered true and what was considered dangerous, and those ideas stuck. Even in so-called secular schools, much of the curriculum still followed the Church-approved timeline of history, with the same cast of heroes and the same blind spots. Think about how you learned history. Which events were highlighted? Which were skipped? How many saints were mentioned compared to scientists or rebels? How many popes compared to poets? That wasn't an accident. The Church understood something important. Control the past, and you control the present. If people believe a certain version of history, they're less likely to question who holds power now. If the past seems neat and divine, then the present seems justified. But real history is messy, full of contradictions, lost voices, burned books, and alternative timelines. Some of that mess was cleaned up by force, and some of it was edited quietly through schools, lesson by lesson, year by year. So who decides what we learn? In many cases, it was not the scholars digging through ruins. It was the men in robes deciding what was safe to teach, and what truths were better left buried. Education is supposed to be a light, but sometimes that light is pointed only where they want you to look. The real question is what's hiding in the shadows, and who put it there. When most people picture the Dark Ages, they don't think of libraries or inventors or lost knowledge. They think of filth and fear and knights swinging swords in the mud. They think of peasants in rags and endless wars. And where did that image come from? Not textbooks, not ruins. It came from movies, from Hollywood. Over the last century, films have played a bigger role in shaping our understanding of history than actual history books. The screen became a storyteller, and the world believed what it showed. But what if that story was guided not just by entertainment, but by something deeper? What if the bleak version of the past was carefully chosen? In movie after movie, the early centuries after Rome's fall are shown as dark, dirty, and hopeless. Wisdom is gone. Art is gone. Only religion remains, and even that is usually shown as controlling or cruel. There's barely a whisper of the ancient world's science or lost inventions, and anything mysterious is labelled superstition. It's easy to write this off as just movie magic. Simpler costumes, easy drama, but over time these images stick. When you see monks burning books in every medieval film, you start to believe that's all there was. When every scholar is portrayed as insane or heretical, you forget that real thinkers once walked those halls. The past gets flattened into a single mood: cold, harsh, and dumb. But here's what's strange. Some scholars argue that those so-called dark centuries may not have been so dark at all. Some say they may not have even happened the way we're told. Yet Hollywood keeps that version alive, as if it's too dangerous to show something different. A medieval world filled with light curiosity, forgotten machines or knowledge that slipped through the cracks. The question is, who benefits from this one-sided story? Because when you train people to think the past was full of ignorance and fear, you make them grateful for the present. You make modern control systems look like progress. You make the church look like the only source of order in a chaotic age. You stop people from asking where the real truth went. Hollywood has been called a dream factory, but it's also a memory factory. It builds what people think they remember, and sometimes those memories are not based on facts, but on scripts, approved scripts. Stories designed to echo the same version of history that schools and pulpits once pushed, the same version that leaves out what came before. So, the next time you see a knight covered in blood or a monk whispering in the dark, ask yourself this: is this history or is it a spell? A story so old and repeated that no one dares question it anymore. Because sometimes the brightest lie wears the darkest costume, and the past they show you might just be a movie set built to block out something real. There's a quiet idea, hidden deep in religious tradition, that most people never notice. It sounds holy, it sounds peaceful, but when you really look at it, it's unsettling. The idea that forgetting is not just allowed, but sacred. That to forget is to be closer to God. That memory itself can be sinful. In the early church, memory was power. To remember the old gods, the old ways, the old texts, meant you carried pieces of a world the new faith wanted to replace. So little by little remembering became dangerous, and forgetting became holy, a kind of spiritual cleansing. You weren't just turning away from sin, you were deleting it, wiping the hard drive of the soul. Monks were taught to meditate not on the past, but on what they were told was eternal. Eternal didn't mean ancient, it meant approved, it meant church written. Everything else was noise. Everything else was temptation. If a text led you to question or remember too much, it was heresy. If a story pointed to forgotten gods or older truths, it had to be buried. And if a person remembered too well, they were watched. This wasn't just censorship, it was doctrine. The idea that true holiness meant obedience, that faith meant not asking, that salvation meant forgetting. Forgetting the parts of the Bible that didn't fit, forgetting the scrolls that were burned, forgetting the years that disappeared from the calendar, forgetting the names of saints that never existed, forgetting what you were never supposed to know in the first place. They made memory a threat, and made the act of forgetting a virtue. Over time, this idea moved out of the monastery and into the world. Entire generations were taught that knowledge was pride, and pride was sin, that curiosity was rebellion, that digging into the past was a distraction from God's plan. The less you asked, the safer you were. The more you erased, the purer you became. It was spiritual amnesia disguised as faith. And this is where it gets strange, because even today, the echoes of that belief remain. People feel guilty for questioning. They feel fear when reading something too old. They're told some doors are best left closed, not because they lead nowhere, but because they lead somewhere that challenges everything, somewhere that was sealed off on purpose. The theology of forgetting isn't just about religion, it's about control. If you can train people to forget their roots, their real history, their stolen knowledge, then you can give them a new story, a new timeline, a new truth, one that serves the ones who wrote it. So if remembering feels wrong, if asking feels like sin, maybe that's not your conscience. Maybe that's programming. A very old spell passed down in sermons and songs and silence. A spell that says memory is dangerous, and forgetting is divine. But But some truths don't die just because they're buried. Some memories fight their way back, and when they do, the whole story begins to change. Some things don't belong in the time they're found. A gear discovered in a tomb where there should only be wooden tools. A lens carved with such precision it rivals modern glasswork. A manuscript describing machines powered by water and air that wouldn't be built again for hundreds of years. These aren't stories from science fiction, they're real. They're artifacts. And they raise questions the official timeline cannot answer. In cathedrals built during the so-called Dark Ages, we find designs that defy what those builders were supposed to know. Perfect acoustics, calculated with math, no one was meant to understand yet. Windows aligned with solstices, as if someone still remembered the ancient science of the stars. Builders who couldn't write their own names yet left behind towers that have stood longer than most empires. Take the Antikythera mechanism, found in a shipwreck, a gear-based machine built in ancient times that mapped the movement of the heavens. It wasn't medieval, but it tells us something important. That people long ago had technology we only recently began to grasp. So when we find similar hints buried in medieval ruins, it makes you wonder, what else are we missing? There are sketches of flying machines, carvings of helicopters in temples, clock towers running on water pressure, batteries made of clay. How did these things exist before the age of science? Who created them? And more importantly, what happened to that knowledge? Historians explain them away. They say they were toys, or art, or accidents. But that only works for so long. When too many impossible things pile up, the story starts to fall apart. These weren't random. They were designed, built, hidden, or destroyed. And here's the twist. Many of these strange inventions appear in places watched closely by the church, monasteries, cathedrals, archives, places where monks copied and rewrote texts, where they decided what was preserved and what was erased. What if some knowledge wasn't lost but locked away? What if the church didn't just destroy forbidden tech, but studied it, rebranded it as divine when useful, called it heresy when not? Imagine a machine that could generate power in the 13th century, or a tool that mapped the earth before explorers ever sailed. What kind of control would that give someone? And what would it threaten? Some of these forgotten engineers left clues, notes in the margins, diagrams hidden in scrolls, references buried in religious texts, enough to make us ask questions, but never quite enough to give us the full picture. That's the trick of it. It wasn't just about hiding inventions, it was about breaking the chain of memory. If you destroy the knowledge but leave behind the machines as artifacts, you create a mystery with no manual, a puzzle that doesn't fit the official story. And maybe that was the point. To erase the past, not just in books but in minds, so we'd stop asking who really built the world we live in, and forget that maybe once long ago someone already did the impossible. Some chains are invisible. They don't rattle. They don't leave bruises, but they hold tighter than iron ever could. They are made of silence, of ritual, of rules that no one is allowed to question. And for centuries, that's how an entire civilization was held in place. Not by soldiers or swords, but by the careful control of thought. Imagine waking up in a world where every answer is already written, where asking why is dangerous, where the truth isn't discovered but handed down in stained glass and incense. That was life for most of Europe during the so-called Dark Ages, a time not just of lost knowledge, but forbidden curiosity. The church didn't need to burn every book, just the wrong ones. It didn't need to silence every voice, just the loudest. And once that fear was planted, people started policing themselves. Not because they were evil, but because they were taught that questions were sins, that faith meant not just belief, but obedience. Schools became temples of repetition. You learned the answers before you even knew the questions. The world was 6,000 years old because a priest said so. The stars moved in perfect circles because a bishop said it glorified God. And the human body was a mystery not to be studied, but to be feared. Dissection was banned. Experiments were heresy. Wonder itself became dangerous. People began to live in loops, following rituals they didn't understand, lighting candles, chanting words, hoping that doing everything just right would keep them safe. But safe from what? They didn't know. That was the trap. The rituals gave comfort, but also replaced knowledge. They gave a sense of control while taking away the tools to truly understand the world. And this wasn't an accident, it was a system, a slow, careful design. The church became the gatekeeper of memory, the guardian of all that was written. If something didn't fit the story, they were telling it was removed, or renamed, or rewritten. Even kings needed permission to think. But not everyone obeyed. Some whispered. Some read the banned books in secret. Some dared to draw the stars as they really moved. And many of them paid for it with their lives, not because they were wrong, but because they made others afraid. This was not a civilization of savages. It was a world of thinkers forced into silence, inventors forced to become monks, healers forced to pray instead of study, artists forced to paint only what they were told. A world locked in place by fear disguised as faith. And yet beneath it all, the questions never stopped. Some hid in the margins of books. Some were passed in quiet conversations. Some travelled across borders, folded into letters no one was supposed to read. Because no matter how tight the chains are, someone always tries to pick the lock. A civilization can be frozen, but not forever, because truth has a habit of surviving. Even when it's buried in ritual and wrapped in silence, there's a question no one wants you to ask. Not in class, not in a textbook, not even in a university built on curiosity. And it's not because the question is rude or cruel or even wrong. It's because the question threatens to unravel everything built around it. And if you ask it out loud, they won't call you evil. They'll call you something worse. Unprofessional, uncredible. A conspiracy theorist. The question changes depending on what you're studying. In history, it might be something simple like, why is there no archaeological layer for those missing centuries? In theology, it might be, why were some Gospels banned if they spoke of the same Jesus? In astronomy, it could be, why do some eclipse records not match the accepted timeline? It doesn't matter what the exact words are. What matters is that it challenges the structure. And in modern academia, structure is sacred. You'd think universities would be the one place to welcome new ideas. But many of them don't. Not when it comes to questioning the timeline, or the shape of the canon, or the real origins of civilization. Professors build careers on repeating what came before. If you publish something too bold, they won't debate you, they'll ignore you, or worse. They'll make sure your work never sees the light of day. Students sense this early. They learn which questions get you good grades and which ones make your teacher uncomfortable. The safe route is to memorize, to footnote, to quote the right sources. If you want a scholarship, or a job, or tenure, you play the game, and slowly the forbidden questions fade. Not because they were answered, but because no one dares to ask them anymore. Sometimes the exiles are quiet. A historian loses their grant. A researcher gets pushed out of a journal. A brilliant mind ends up teaching high school because they wouldn't follow the script. Other times, It's louder. A speaker gets banned, a book gets blacklisted. A whole field of study becomes a joke overnight because it got too close to something uncomfortable. And here's the twist. The censorship doesn't need to come from the church anymore. Academia does it to itself. Through peer review, through committees, through invisible lines no one dares cross. The same systems that were once built to protect truth can now be used to bury it. But curiosity is stubborn. It survives rejection. It survives exile. It survives even when entire careers are ruined for asking the wrong thing. Because people still whisper, still search, still dig through the past for the pieces that don't fit. And sometimes those outcasts are the ones who change everything. The forbidden question is not dangerous because it's false. It's dangerous because it might be true. And truth has always been the greatest threat to control, especially the kind dressed in robes, or hidden behind university walls. It calls itself the guardian of truth, a beacon of faith, a preserver of knowledge passed down through the ages. But behind the marble and gold, behind the stained glass and choirs, the Vatican holds another title, one it doesn't put on display. It is also the gatekeeper. And every gatekeeper decides who gets in and who stays out. For centuries, the Vatican has claimed to protect sacred knowledge, and in some ways it has. It saved ancient texts while empires fell. It copied scrolls while fires raged. It stored fragile pages deep underground, where war and weather couldn't reach. But protection comes with a price. You only get to read what they decide you're ready for. And what they decide you're never ready for stays locked away. It's a strange balance. On one side, they're priests, caretakers of divine wisdom. On the other, they act like wardens, making sure some truths stay sealed forever. There are entire vaults no pope has fully seen. Entire libraries that don't appear on any public record. Documents marked not by their holiness, but by their danger, not because they lie, but because they ask too much. They hold heretical texts, early gospels that paint Jesus in unfamiliar light, pagan scriptures that survived Roman conquest, maps that show lands before explorers ever arrived, timelines that stretch back beyond what the church says is possible. These aren't just historical oddities, they're cracks in the official story. And cracks, if you press hard enough, can turn into doorways. But those doorways are heavily guarded. Scholars have begged for access. Some are granted a glimpse, a single manuscript, a few hours. Watched by officials the whole time. No copies, no cameras. Just memory. Others are denied completely, not because they aren't qualified, but because their questions are too specific, their interests too dangerous. Why? Why hide knowledge in a place built on truth? Maybe because truth can unravel belief. Maybe because if certain facts surfaced, entire stories would collapse. Stories that took centuries to build. Stories that give power, legitimacy, control. The Vatican claims it must protect the faithful from confusion. That some knowledge would do more harm than good. But who decides what harms and what heals? And when did protecting faith become the same as controlling thought? A gatekeeper is not just a protector. It is a filter. And the Vatican has filtered more than just books. It has filtered time, memory, history itself. For every text it preserved, there is another it locked away. For every truth it preached, there was one it feared. So when we look at the Vatican, not just as a church, but as an archive with walls thicker than stone, we must ask a simple question. What are they really guarding? Is it faith, or is it control dressed as tradition? The guardian of the gate wears white robes, but it also holds the key to rooms we are never meant to enter. And sometimes the silence behind those doors says more than any sermon ever could. Imagine it. One key, turning in a lock that hasn't moved in centuries. One heavy door, groaning open to reveal the secrets hidden deep beneath Vatican soil. No security guards, no permission slips, just raw truth. Ancient manuscripts stacked like bones, scrolls sealed in wax, maps with coastlines we don't recognize. A vault not of gold, but of memory. Memory the world was told to forget. If the vault were opened, everything might change. Maybe we'd find the missing books of the Bible, the ones that told different stories. That said, Jesus laughed. That Mary was more than just a mother. That heaven wasn't up in the clouds, but something within us. Maybe the old Gospels didn't just go missing. Maybe they were silenced because they made the church's version feel smaller. Or what if there were maps from before Columbus showing the Americas, showing Antarctica without ice? What if explorers came long before we thought and wrote it all down in ink the Vatican buried? Suddenly the history we learned in school would feel like a fairy tale. The age of discovery would feel more like a cover-up. And maybe the vault hides proof of lost technology, devices described in ancient texts, machines that ran without fuel, lights that never burned out. What if the miracle stories in the Bible weren't miracles at all, but misunderstood science? What if manna from heaven was just a synthetic food, the Ark of the Covenant, a power source, the parting of the sea, a calculated use of energy? If the Vatican knew these things and kept them from us, the question wouldn't just be why, it would be what else. We might find texts written before the Bible, ancient Egyptian scrolls that trace the flood story back thousands of years, Babylonian astronomy charts that show planets in places they shouldn't be, all of it carefully preserved, all of it quietly hidden. Because if people saw the overlap, if they realized faiths once shared the same roots, maybe they'd stop fighting over who was right and start asking why we were told to forget. Even darker possibilities could emerge. Letters between emperors and popes, plans to rewrite time, evidence that parts of the calendar were shifted, that whole centuries might not have happened the way we think. That would mean kings never ruled, wars never started. That we live in a version of history written to protect power, not truth. And what if, among all this paper and parchment, we found something not human, writings that didn't come from this world, visitors mistaken for angels, warnings we ignored, a different origin of mankind, one that makes our current story feel like a bedtime lie? If the vault were opened, the Vatican wouldn't be the only thing exposed. Our entire timeline, our faiths, our science, our sense of self might unravel. But maybe that's exactly why the door stays locked. Because the truth isn't just dangerous, it's freeing. And freedom is harder to control than silence. There's a kind of silence that feels heavy, the kind that lives in old buildings, in forgotten books, in places no one's allowed to go. But silence isn't the same as absence. Just because something isn't spoken doesn't mean it never happened. Just because a book is missing doesn't mean the words inside it weren't once read. Truth doesn't vanish, it waits. The Vatican's vaults, the chained libraries, the burned manuscripts, the erased names, all of it was about memory, about making sure some things were remembered and others were buried. And for a long time, that strategy worked. Whole civilizations forgot who they were. We started calling things myths that were once facts. We accepted timelines handed to us like bedtime stories, neat, clean, controlled, but memory is slippery. It survives in strange places, in symbols carved into temple walls, in lullabies that grandmothers sing without knowing why, in ruins that don't fit the story, in questions that keep coming back no matter how many times they're dismissed. You can lock away paper, but not wonder. You can burn books, but not the feeling that something is missing. And now, people are remembering, asking why a church would own one of the most powerful observatories in the world, wondering what's inside a vault no pope has ever fully seen, looking at maps that show Antarctica centuries before it was discovered, reading about saints who never lived, scientists who were silenced, timelines that bend in ways that don't add up. None of this is about hate. It's about hunger. A hunger to know, to understand where we came from, what we lost, what was taken. Because when you control memory, you control identity. And when you erase the past, you chain the future. But the chains are breaking. Every time someone questions the official version, every time a hidden manuscript is digitized, every time a student reads something that makes them pause and think and ask, that's a crack in the wall, a tear in the curtain, a light in the dark. This isn't about proving one story wrong. It's about freeing all the stories, letting people remember for themselves, letting them see the full picture instead of just the parts someone decided were safe. Because the truth was never meant to be locked away. It was meant to be lived, shared, felt. And maybe that's the real danger. Not that the truth is too explosive, but that it's too human, too beautiful, too powerful to control once it's out. So as we close this journey, just remember this. The vaults may stay sealed for now. The timelines may still be bent. But the questions are louder than ever. And sometimes, remembering is the most dangerous thing you can do. But it's also the most important.